Okay, good morning everyone. If you would please take your seats and we'll get started. Okay, so welcome to the seminar on the comprehensive reform of state research institutes and research funding, the evaluation of this reform to be specific. We would like to call it the TULA evaluation in brief. It's quite a long name. I'd like to welcome all of you who are present here in Paasitorni, but also those who are following through stream. We are live streaming to other people in the country, so anyone wanting to participate is welcome to do so. My name is Kirsi Pulkkinen. I'm a researcher at the University of Lapland, and I'm also part of the evaluation team with many others, and I will be moderating the seminar today. We have a very packed program, as you can see, and so just a few words on the working methods. You will see all the PowerPoint presentations that are presented here today. They will be placed on the web pages of the Prime Minister's office, so you can find all of them there. We also use the Screen I/O tool. I hope many of you have used it before, but if not, it's not very difficult, so not to worry. So for the Screen I/O tool, we have our own expert here. He will be posing direct questions where you can answer in Finnish, Swedish, or English. You can pose comments, questions, what you might be thinking of. And also, there will be general comment boxes, so you can comment on the seminar as a whole, the specific speeches of our presenters, and so on, in addition to the questions that we set for you. All of these Screen I/O slots will be open the entire day, so not to worry, you can always go back and comment more. The comments are anonymous, and they will remain so. We also use Twitter, so if you like, tweet away using the hashtags TULA-arviointi or tietokäyttöön. They will also be shown on the same screen, so you can see what the discussions are. But without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Kaisa Lähteenmäki-Smith from the Prime Minister's office. Kaisa is chair of the Evaluation Project Steering Group, and she will officially open the seminar. The floor is yours, Kaisa.
Thank you, Kirsi. And thank you. Nice to see so many of you here today, and I hope there are plenty of people also following us online on the stream that's facilitated. It's important to start the discussion. As we know, the TULA reform was undertaken already based on a decision from 2013, 2014, the implementation started. So it seems like a long time since then. Lots has happened since then. And obviously today, this is just the first step. This is the first impressions as it stands. And this is the right time also to discuss the questions, the goals that were originally set and how they have been implemented and how they have been achieved so far. As we know, the reform was undertaken as a response to many of the changes and challenges facing both research and our government and the governance in our society. There was need to get research evidence better into societal decision-making, contribute to governance and guidance of previously sector-based research to better respond to the changing needs of our society. The operational environment has undergone major changes, and the knowledge needs equally so. The conundrums that we face today have changed. A number of so-called wicked problems, as we often discuss, relating to issues ranging from social inclusion to climate change to security in a digital, interconnected era come to mind. The need to provide a firm basis for planning, implementation, and the future foresight with accurate, timely, and relevant knowledge has also given rise to the need of closer interaction and collaboration between the different fields and the different parties involved in this dialogue and involved in decision making. The dialogue is important, perhaps not first and foremost, because there are new questions that we need to answer, even though that's also the case, but maybe more importantly, because in order to answer these in any meaningful way, we need to increase our shared understanding of what those problems are and creating not only the best evidence base, but also the most open and inclusive dialogue and shared understanding of the questions themselves. And this is why we are here today, and I hope that everyone contributes actively to this, clarifying these questions and maybe coming to a shared understanding. The external evaluation of the comprehensive reform, the TULA reform, as Kirsi put it, is implemented as part of the government's research and assessment activity, so partly also facilitated by the reform itself. The main purpose of our evaluation was to commission an external knowledge base and analysis of whether the reform has actually achieved its goals, whether it has been implemented in a manner that is accurate, that is effective, efficient, and the impacts are, or what the impacts are, obviously looking at both the intended consequences and the impacts and those that were not perhaps intended. Today we don't have many results yet. This is really the start and launch of the evaluation work itself. But we've asked also the evaluators to describe and to tell of the steps that they're going to take, of the working packages that they're going to be involved in, so that each and every one of you and your background and your communities and your organizations can better understand how you could contribute or be involved in the discussion in the year to come. Actually, the evaluation will only finish in November 2018, so there is a year and a bit before it is actually the results are finalized. But a lot will happen in the meanwhile in between. We're particularly happy today that we have international experts here today. This was one of the reasons why the team that is today at work here today with the evaluation was selected for this work, because they had both a comprehensive and holistic view of the evaluation, both quantitative and qualitative analysis, but also because they have international perspectives. Often, in our case, of course, it's easy to be so busy and so absorbed in your everyday work that you kind of forget the broader picture, become too absorbed in our domestic everyday concerns to raise our head above the parapet, so to say. So I welcome you all to this seminar today. I hope we have a really open and active conversation and dialogue and discussion, and I look forward to the evaluation getting on the way. I'll give the floor back to the evaluation team. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaisa. That was a good setting of the broader context in which the reform and the evaluation of the reform is put. So now it's time to move to the evaluation itself. Next, Dr. Mari Hjelt will come and present the first impressions of this evaluation. Now, as Kaisa mentioned, these are only the first impressions based on the first work package of the evaluation, which is quite lengthy and large. Mari will soon go through all of this in more detail. Mari is the managing director of Gaia Consulting and has acted as the leader of Work Package 1. Welcome, Mari.
Okay, good morning to everybody. And this is the point to tell some findings or the first impressions that we as an evaluation team do have. And at this point, I think we have more questions than answers, but we still have some time to work further. I'm here on the behalf of the whole evaluation team, so we have a pretty big consortium and the evaluation team and international experts, so that when we have a discussion, some of us will try to answer some of the questions that you have. I will shortly describe our evaluation process, then go a little bit back to the key drivers, that why did we have this national big reform, and then our first impressions that what has happened. As Kaisa already told, the evaluation has started this year and will continue over a year from this point, and we aim to have a final report by November next year. The first work package was really scoping the evaluation, that what are the questions that are of interest, and what is basically the things that we are evaluating, and what are the things that have just happened and are outside our scope. And also looking a little bit at the operating environment, that what has happened in Finland during the past years, or let's say the 20 years from this backwards. The first work package, as a method, we had a lot of interviews, almost 50 interviews. But those were mostly targeted to director level, the top management and the key experts. We also had extensive written material that we went through, going to background documents behind the reform and some of the strategy papers, and there is still a lot of material that we go back to over the following phases. The next steps after this work package, we will go into details of the fact-finding. So looking at the questions that what was really the quality, impacts, the relevance, effectiveness, and looking at how basically the aims that were set for the reform were reached, to that extent that we can say at this point. Over the winter, we will, as a method base for this, we will organize a survey, go further with the written material, the facts, the financials, but also we'll organize a regional workshops, and that will be an important point for all of you and for the research organizations to participate in the evaluation, and perhaps to have a more the point of view from the researcher point of view, that how the reform has affected the everyday work in research. Why the reform took place? I think that Kaisa already highlighted the main aims. The main aims for the reform were here at the top. That the society is facing a lot of challenges that are not solved by one ministry or one organization. They need a more cross-sectoral view and cross-sectoral work together to solve some of the challenges. And for that, the decision makers, they need more high quality and multidisciplinary research, which is offered also in a format that's usable. So very much the reform was also targeting to create the new ways of communicating and disseminating some of the research results. Then there were some, structural worries. First, it was the competitiveness of Finnish research, that whether Finnish research is internationally competitive, and there had been worries over that one. And it's also, I think, a constant worry for a small nation like Finland, so how we survive in the competition in the world. Then several evaluations and the studies had pointed out that the Finnish research system was highly fragmented. And next to the state research institute reform, it's important to note that there was also a university reform just preceding this, and those are linked partly together. So that the smaller units need to be combined to be bigger and more to reach the critical mass, and also to remove some of the sectoral barriers. Then it was the question about the ministerial steering of the research, so that when we have these cross-sectoral challenges that require cross-sectoral work, so how that's steered from the ministry and how to avoid the silos. And then one was the cooperation between the research organizations and the companies, that Finland generally is in a well position in this sense, but still it was a question that, especially from the research institutes, that this should be strengthened. Then there were the things that the drivers that were also behind, perhaps a little bit more operational. Since the financial crisis 2008-2009, the economic situation in Finland has not been very positive, and that had created a lot of pressure to get more from less, so the efficiency goals. Then also feeling that, or facts that the research results, there is more than is now used, so that the results are not used to the full potential. So how to tap that potential? And then also last but not least, it's also how the research is done nowadays. The transformation of the ways of doing good, high-quality research in an open manner, in a closer cooperation, and different ways of disseminating the information. So all these things drive to this reform, and already now I think it's fair to say that everybody thinks that overall the reform was good that it was finally done, because it was prepared for quite many decades actually, so that the reform was a good thing. But one thing, the first impression, and which will be a big challenge for us and has been the challenge for the research system, is this. So since the reform, it's very important to note that the reform didn't propose budget cuts, so that to reduce the resources and funding available. But after the reform, there have been further government cut-offs in R&D funding that were not part of the reform. And this is a big challenge for us as evaluators, and it has been a big challenge for the research organizations. So next to big changes, you have to also survive with a little bit less money. So basically, here is the picture. This small red part is the volume of the reform when looking at the money. And it was not like the reform was mostly reallocation of some of the funding from budget to new funding instruments. So it was not like a cut-off. But after the reform, some cut-offs were introduced, and this affects some of the results and the changes that we see. And it's very difficult to separate the effect of those from the effect of the reform itself. When looking now who were the main implementation bodies of the reform that the actions were targeted to, here it's basically the state research institutes faced structural changes. There were mergers of them and mergers of some with the universities. So the universities were targeted as a precise target for the actions. And then the government and the ministries, and also the funding agencies. But it's important to understand that there is a much larger group of stakeholders who are the producers of the knowledge. And so there are also private research institutes, universities of applied sciences, different consultancies, think tanks, NGOs, private sector overall. And the users of the research results are the whole society as well. So that next to the government and the ministries, there is of course the parliament, political decision making, the public sector, the regional administration, different agencies, the private sector, and the civil society at large. So the research results should be used over all these stakeholders. One first, I think is fair, and we are quite confident to say that overall the cooperation in the system has improved in many ways. There are different linkages. And the cooperation here refers to, let's say, willingness among the people to do work together. So that when you have a challenge or question that you call to fellow colleague in another research institute or in other ministry, that let's do something together. And I think that here the reform and the actions, of course, they're really forced to cooperate if you are basically forced to merge with well, with your fellow organization, then you have to like discuss it together. It's natural. But anyway, there are a lot of cooperation connections, and I would like to highlight 3 of them that we find to be the most important for the reform. First, the cooperation among the ministries is clearly, I think it has improved, because the ministries, they have to, for example, define some of the research priorities together when they design some of the directions for the research. Then I think there is also other evaluation and recent studies that show clearly that the research institutes and universities, they cooperate much more than previously. And then the third point is that among the state research institutes, and here we have some question marks for the next winter. The state research institutes, it's clear that at the strategic level, they have done more work together. We have some of the network actions, like the Soterco and the Lunet network that were part of the reform, and also now the new TULA-net. So there clearly there is improved cooperation. But the question mark that we have is linked to the actual operational level cooperation among the researchers and at the project level. We had some indications and the discussions that whether the increased competition had actually blocked some of the practical cooperation at the research level. And this is something that we want to study a little bit deeper over the next work packages. Then I have 3 points of the strategic level, like our first observations. Even when you do cooperation, that doesn't mean that you have the same aims and your strategy is streamlined in an efficient manner. And when we look at, let's say, the government, the policy level, I think that we all know and have read also in the recent reviews that in Finland over the last years there has been a certain lack of clear science, technology, innovation, vision, and the target setting. And this has had some implications that this, let's say, the governmental strategic steering has perhaps been a little bit weak. So the question is that if you have introduced a reform, and then after that introduce some of the cut-offs in the resources, so whether those are streamlined together. And has there been really a joint understanding that what are the main aims of the reform, and especially now, that what will be the aims for the future? Because when you do these type of reforms, it should be like reassessed and also corrected some of the actions. So whether the strategic steering for that is now at the right place. At the ministry level, we also have some mixed messages. Although there are the new funding instruments and there is a cooperation, and cooperation has clearly improved, but still there seems to be some weaknesses in the strategic cooperation between the ministries. And of course it's a fact that also the ministries are competing partly with each other and competing over the money and also the budget allocations. So there is, I think, a constant pressure to go back to the silos and how to avoid that in the future. But then when we look at the state research institutes, there, of course, if you are in a situation where you have to do very big strategic decisions and do things together and you are merged with other research institutes, there you can see, of course, a strong strategic level changes, and it has been vital to have a very good steering due to the new structures and funding mechanisms, and a lot of changes has taken place. Well, the next question is that when you have a strategic changes, what happens at the operational level? To put it very simply, the reform was new organizational structures and new funding instruments. And then you have to cope with that one. The organizational structures, I think that we all know that if some big organizations are merged together or split or whatever happens at the system level, it takes a really long time to have the new organizations ready and competitive. And these additional budget cut-offs didn't help in this process to have those institutes to be up and running quickly. And then the funding instruments, I think it might have been a little bit a surprise even that it takes a really long time for the funding instruments to be really ready. And it has been like few years to test and to develop, and they start to now be ready. And we have it's a good moment to look at the first results from that. And it's important to know that the full final implementation plan was not ready when the reform started at 2013. And it's also important to note that many of the actions had been prepared already years before that. So it's a continuous process. And that's also, I think, is very important. It's not a bad thing. It's not something that you could have even planned the whole reform to be fully ready for implementation at that point of time. Generally, as I started, the renewal and the reform and the willingness to renew is seen overall as a positive thing. I think that none of the interviewees said that it was better previously, so let's go back to the old system. So it has been a good thing, but these operational changes, they require a continuous experimentation, testing, motivation and engagement, patience and time, and also revisiting some of the changes that perhaps we should do things in other ways and not to be really stuck with some of the actions that were designed like 5 years ago. And then it is like this, the changes have forced the research institutes to change their operations, but it has been slow. It has been a little bit difficult to catch up in a new situation to be fully competitive. And it's partly to be seen that how competitive they will be and how, let's say, how they fulfill their task in producing the research results that would be usable for the decision maker. And then one final thing is that the focus has been the state research institutes. But then we think that the processes and working methods of the ministries have not received perhaps enough attention and, more important, enough resources, because the changes there also require a lot of labor and work and resources that have not perhaps been available. So a summary: cooperation has improved, but we have some questions about the weaknesses in the strategic level follow-up. The big structural changes are not enough, and I think this is typical in Finland, that we assume that when we change the structure, the problem is solved, but it's not in that way. And the operational changes, they just take time and should continue towards the direction that was the main aim of the reform. And we think that it's generally the mindset, and we have a positive feeling over this first round of interviews, that the mindset for using the research as a strategic resource for decision making has improved. But the question remains that how much is this due to the reform? So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mari, for the good presentation. I'm sure you have a lot of questions, perhaps comments also for Mari. While you're preparing those, I'll pose you a question instead. Has the reform promoted better use of research results in decision making? This was one of the main aims of the reform. It should be visible on the screen I/O, so you're welcome to comment on that question, what your experiences, your thoughts on that are. But now to your questions. We have some minutes for direct questions to Mari, and then we'll continue after that. Please present yourself and your institution. Thank you.
Tuija Pulkkinen from Aalto University. When you say that the results are not yet so visible, how do you measure success of the reform?
That's a very good question, and there is no one measure for the success, because also the aims for the reform were quite multifold, and so it is, I think, the main aim of, and very difficult to measure, is the use of the results in the decision making, and who are the decision makers. So I think that here it's the measuring part. We look lot of different sources and different points of view. So it's very much goes to the project level. So it's very important, for example, that there is ongoing the first evaluation of the strategic research projects, that how there the results were used. So that's, for example, one very important source for us now over this year. And then it is also part is like asking in a qualitative manner in the surveys that how the researchers see the changes, and if the aims and the success is partly question about the cost efficiency, so it's also going a little bit the funding and the financials of the organizations that how that can be measured. So I think that there is no one answer to the measure of the success in this case, when the goals and the aims were quite a long list of things that are measured in a different ways.
We have another question right at the... Thank you. Please use the microphone so that the people following through stream are able to hear you. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. My name is Teemu Kokko. I'm the president of Haga-Helia University of Applied Sciences, and thank you for your presentation. My question is, or actually first of all, reflection. I got a little bit worried because the universities of applied sciences were quite neglected in your presentation, and the fact is that there's lots of research going on in University of Applied Sciences. We were kind of placed in the outer circle, and even in your key drivers, you said that removement of sectoral barriers. So my question is that how can you guarantee that in this assessment also University of Applied Sciences are considered and taken care of and taken seriously? Because as the presentation now was, we had a total kind of side role, and what's your reflection about this?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it is also we have been thinking that, especially now lately in the evaluation team. But anyway, the slide and with the circle in the inside, it was purely looking the action points of the reform. So who are implementing some of the concrete actions, and the universities are there because some of the research institutes were moved and merged with universities. So that's an action point. None of the research institutes was moved with the University of Applied Sciences. But of course the funding instruments are affecting also all the research result producers. So it's also the private research institutes where they're on the outer circle, because they are of course using, for example, some of the funding to do the research, and also think tanks and consultancies were on the outer circle, but they are using some of the money to do research. And that's a change in the system that we have to look into a little bit more detail. So the circles there just were highlighting that who were the targets of the practical actions and the implementation. But it doesn't mean that for example, universities of applied system would be outside the research system and have an important role in producing the research results. And that's also perhaps the question when we go towards our recommendations, that how the whole research system has reacted, and whether things have improved, and what would be the role of the University of Applied Sciences in the system, and whether that would need some targeted actions in the future. And there I think it's very important that when we have the regional discussion seminars over the winter time, that we hope to have their participants broadly from representing the research result producers. And so it doesn't mean that it will be outside the whole reform, although here we focus on the practical implementation.
There was another question at the front here.
Hi, thanks. Lula Rosso from VTT. When you looked at cooperation, did you look specifically at infrastructures, cooperation on infrastructures? Because this is a bit the elephant in the room, isn't it? It's a large part of investment and cost for researchers.
Again, a very good question. Here it's as a part of this evaluation, we have not yet yet looked that in detail, but we know, and we have looked to that extent that we, for example, know about the campus cooperation for the research institutes, and this is part of the observation that the cooperation between the research institutes and the universities have improved. So because it's also cooperation around the infrastructures. But here I think it's a big issue that is a little bit beyond the scope of this evaluation. I mean that although the reform was promoting, for example, the cooperation in a campus areas, and of course it's linked to the use of the infrastructure, and some of the budget cuts affected in a way that some of the research infrastructures and let's say the observation units were like stopped. But it's something that we, I think, need to also look a little bit detail over the winter time. But it's a big money issue and quite complicated. So this was not a clear answer, but a good question.
Okay, time is moving quickly. Just to be sure, our colleague Susanna here, she's following the screen IO questions and comments. Is there something you would like to raise from there, Susanna?
Yes, so far it seems like there is consensus that the cooperation has improved, yet there is still much improvement to be done. So please keep posting your comments.
Thank you. Now there will be much time for discussion and more questions later on, but now we will move forward to the next part of our seminar. Like Kaisa mentioned in the beginning, we have two international experts as part of our evaluation team, two very valuable experts. We have Professor Peter Maassen from the University of Oslo and Dr. Paul Cunninghamin from the University of Manchester. And they will give an international perspective to the Finnish reform and the context in which it was set. Both of them have extensive experience and knowledge from several comparable cases such as the UK, Denmark, Canada, Ireland and so on. So first to our first speaker, Professor Maassen. He's Professor of Higher Education and Science Studies at the University of Oslo. He's a political scientist by training with a special interest in the areas of governance, funding and organization of higher education and science. Professor Maassen has an extensive academic track record with over 250 international publications. He is the editor of internationally renowned book series in higher education, and in addition, he's been involved in a number of evaluations, audits and experts panels in the field of higher education. So it's my great pleasure to invite Professor Peter Maassen to present his reflections. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your kind words as an introduction. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Prime Minister's office and the team responsible for the evaluation to invite me to share a number of reflections and thoughts with you. It's good to see many familiar faces around the room here. I've had the pleasure of working with a number of Finnish colleagues throughout the years and been involved in a number of evaluations, especially in the sector of universities of applied sciences. So I will refer to that to some extent, but the starting point is this question, of course. How to make research function more effectively as a strategic resource for political decision-making and societal development. That's a core question for the reform, for the evaluation, for the development of the Finnish RDI sector, and it looks a bit like searching for the Holy Grail. The Holy Grail of relevant research. Where do we find it? Do we find it on eBay? Probably not. Or the quest for the garden of innovation. We all are looking around the world for this garden of innovation, but we also know the moment we find it, there are many contenders to claim the innovation and to use it in a way that might not be originally intended. There are also many attempts to identify a one-size-fits-all approach to the kind of research that we are discussing here, whether we call it policy research or society-oriented research, with various steps, for example, or to look at what kind of information is used in policy research, also here trying to identify the ideal types. However, we all know what works in the US, what works in the UK doesn't necessarily work in Finland, and the other way around. There's the famous study by Manuel Castells and Pekka Himmanen from 2002, which at that time promoted the Finnish model as the only viable or the most viable alternative to Silicon Valley, being equally dynamic in technological and economic terms, but combining information society with the welfare state. So providing an alternative for those who assumed that the Holy Grail could be found in California. And in general, this leads to the question how to do justice to the importance of national contexts when it comes to political decision making, to using research and information for societal development, for strengthening economic competitiveness, and how to handle the great variety and the quality and diversity of policy ideas and policy alternatives across countries. And here, what is an important concept is knowledge regimes. This is the first study of its kind of Campbell and Peterson, Campbell from the US, but also with a position at the Copenhagen Business School, and Peterson from the Copenhagen Business School. They looked at national origins of political ideas. The ideas, the information, the knowledge that is used also in the Finnish context, in political processes, in societal development, are to a large extent national. And the structure that they refer to, the regime that they refer to, where these ideas come from, the term knowledge regime refers to fields of policy, research organizations, institutions that govern them. So all kinds of organizations can be identified that feed into the political decision-making process as well as the societal development process. And here is a definition from Campbell and Peterson from knowledge regimes: the organizational, institutional machinery that generates data, research, policy recommendations, and other information and ideas that influence policy making, public debate, societal development. And what they claim is that policymakers, both in the public sector as well as strategic developers in the private sector, they need information produced by knowledge regimes insofar as the problems that they confront often involve ambiguity and uncertainty, and they need to make sense of problems. So an important part also of the kind of research and information that we're talking about here, that is the object of the reform and the evaluation, is the notion of sense-making. Knowledge regimes as sense-making apparatus. But we also see, and Campbell and Peterson have referred to it, but we can see it in many ways also in Finland, that during periods of crisis, sense-making can take a lot of time and may involve changing the sense-making apparatus itself. And it's exactly what the reform tries to do, changing the way in which sense-making, in the way described here, takes place in Finland. Now, Campbell and Peterson have criticized the traditional way of looking at policy research organizations, or in a broader way, the way in which ideal types have been identified with respect to the knowledge, the research, the information produced of relevance for policymaking and private sector development. And originally, or traditionally in the literature, these types of organizations are identified. The private scholarly organizations, the private advocacy organizations, research organizations, think tanks affiliated with political parties, and state research organizations, assuming that each country has a variety of these four types. But the shortcomings are that not each country has examples of every type. There's a blurring among the four types, and there are types of research organizations that do not fit this fourfold typology. So what they, Campbell and Peterson, have come up with is this a study of 4 countries, USA, France, Germany, and Denmark, where you can find a large mix of organizations that produce research and information of relevance for policymaking and societal development, where you see very strong differences among countries. They identified far more than the 4 ideal types and show, for example, that temporary semi-public organizations are very strong in the Danish knowledge regime, but non-existent in the knowledge regimes in the other countries. Another example is the role of universities, which in Denmark has changed after the integration of most of the research institutes, the public research institutes, in the university sector, where, as a consequence, the university now plays a moderate role in the Danish knowledge regime, only a weak role in Germany and no role in France or USA. Or the role of clubs. Clubs is an alien kind of organization in a Nordic context, but it's influential in France. It fits the French knowledge regime, and there's an influence in the French knowledge regime of private clubs. So here you can also see what kind of changes have taken place. I won't go into detail. The PowerPoints are available. You can see in more detail how Campbell and Peterson interpreted these changes, but you can look at the way in which, for example, they identified that in Denmark, the state has increasingly developed a control over research, and there's an increasing reliance on competition and on expert advising within the Danish knowledge regime. If we look at Finland, what are the specific characteristics of the Finnish knowledge regime? I would assume that in the next phase of the reform evaluation, it could be of use to look at the way in which, in the Finnish knowledge regime, traditionally these types of organizations have played a role in developing, producing relevant information, relevant ideas, relevant research that has been used within the various political and other arenas. And also the major changes. Is it so that we can call the Finnish knowledge regime a coordinated negotiations system? Or is it preferable to characterize it in another way? But it's important, again, to do justice to the specific nature, the history of the Finnish knowledge regime, and see where changes are of relevance instead of trying to reinvent a system and not taking the tradition and the Finnish knowledge regime into account. Quickly, some examples from other countries. Norway is a country with a strong institute sector, research institute sector. It was established in the mid-1940s, right after the Second World War. Practice-oriented R&D funding to these institutes with a variety of ownership status. Some are limited companies, some are foundations. One is still ministry-owned. There was a very strong tradition in Norway of having institutes, research institutes that were ministry-owned, but most have moved to foundation or limited company status. There are 4 types of institutes. The first type is in the technical industrial area, the second focusing on environment issues. There's a primary industries institute sector and a social science institute sector, and each of these sectors has specific characteristics and specific relationships and roles in the Norwegian knowledge regime. And there's an important role for the Research Council of Norway in the management of the institute sector in Norway. They are expected to regularly evaluate the institutes and the disciplines to which they belong. So on the website of the Norwegian Research Council, you find a rich variety of evaluation reports, most of them in English, which give you a very good insight into the dynamics of change in the Norwegian institute sector. The Norwegian Research Council manages the core funding system because each research institute in Norway has the right to apply for basic funding from the Norwegian Research Council. There are competitive arenas for providing grants to the institutes, the performance of the institutes, so the research they produce, the influence they've had, is monitored by the Research Council. There's an annual dialogue, but the Research Council doesn't have the authority to make wider decisions about the sector. And its role, or the relative allocation of resources between the institutes and other research performing organizations, is not necessarily a role of the Research Council. So their importance in the management of the research institute sector has increased. They're very important in evaluating and monitoring performance, but the main responsibility for developing both the policy and the basic decisions about funding still lies with the government and the Ministry of Education and Research in Norway. The core funding, all research institutes in Norway, and there are quite a lot of them, are eligible for receiving core funding from the Research Council, which isn't directly linked to projects, but as indicated, core funding. And here are the conditions: undertake research of interest to the Norwegian society, whether it's business or government or the public sector, maintaining the capabilities, the disciplinary, the scientific capabilities, with a strong emphasis on publication, international publication, conducting research activities of sufficient scale, and have a variety of sources of research income. So the Research Council judges each year the institute sector and decides which institutes are eligible for core funding. And in the social science institute sector, just as an indication, all institutes, practically all institutes at the moment receive core funding, and for some it's 2.5% of their budget, but for others close to 25%. So you can imagine that 25% of your budget in the form of a basic grant, which isn't earmarked for some specific activities, gives quite a stable foundation for the institution in question. Just as a last piece of information, here you can see the development in Norway of the various formal institutions, the old universities, the university colleges or universities of applied sciences, the specialized universities, and we have 4 new universities in Norway since 2008, and the research institutes. And these are the organizations, research organizations that are eligible to apply for basic research funding in the free open competition program of the Norwegian Research Council, which is a very competitive, high-status program where a lot of researchers apply. You can see that the budget, Norway is still a rich country, I'm sorry for that, but the budget has increased quite dramatically. And you can see that the division of funding over the various competitors hasn't changed much. The old universities, Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, and Tromsø, still have about 3/4 of the funding in this, even with the doubling of the budget in this program, the free program. The universities of applied sciences have become more competitive, but have had limited success until now. The specialized universities, amongst other things, the architectural university and some business schools, they have not been successful here. The new universities also haven't been very successful, but the institute sector has remained stable. Close to 20% of the basic research projects funded through Free Pro are taking place in the research institute sector. There's a regular evaluation. Here's the mandate. I won't go into detail, but I can recommend you, those of you who are interested, to look at this kind of evaluation report. It gives you a very good insight into the change dynamics of the institute sector in Norway. And finally, what's the future? The future is that there's no plan to integrate the sector into the higher education sector, to move them towards universities or universities of applied sciences, or to change their primary role. So in Norway, there isn't a feeling of crisis, and there isn't a feeling that there's a need to change the knowledge regime. But voluntarily, a number of the research institutes in the social science part have merged with universities of applied sciences, not with research universities, but they've moved towards the universities of applied sciences, and that process is still continuing. Very briefly about Denmark, because it's also an interesting example of change dynamics in a university institute sector, and it's also a country where the political leadership has developed a very strong vision. The globalization strategy since 2005 had a very important role also in the political agreement to increase the public budget for R&D to over 1% of the national GDP. The globalization strategy starting in 2005 had in essence most influence in the higher education and research institute sector, and it led, amongst other things, to an integration of the government research institutes into the universities, at least most of them. In some cases, 3 in total, the government research institution agreed with its ministry, because most of these were owned by a ministry, that it would not be of benefit to the ministry for the institute to merge with the university. So 3 institutes have remained outside, and there's still a discussion on what to do with them. But most of all other government research institutes have merged with the universities. There's been an evaluation in 2009, which is also of relevance for the Finnish reform and the evaluation, discussing the fact that reform in Denmark started. It led to a lot of change, but it wasn't finished in 2009. And now it's 2017 and it's still not finished. So despite the overall positive interpretation of the Danish innovation landscape, the R&D landscape, and Paul will also tell more about that afterwards, there is a feeling that Denmark is in the middle of a reform that never has been finished. That was started in the mid-2000s, but that still has to be completed. And there is, amongst other things, as part of this, a preference for the remaining GRIs to be integrated into the university sector, but there is not enough political support to realize that. The reference, won't go into detail, but I would recommend especially the report by the Research Council at this website. You can find a lot of other publications about the research institute sector. Briefly, as a final reflection, relevant issues very early in the process, the evaluation process, and to some extent even the reform process with respect to Finland. What are the issues that struck me? First, as has been mentioned already, it's important to have a strong future-oriented governmental RDI vision, which has to clarify also the roles of the various sectors in the Finnish knowledge regime and the way in which these sectors should develop their mission and play a role. An understanding of the specific nature of the Finnish knowledge regime within its various contexts. Of course, there is a global context which is of importance, but for understanding and further developing and modernizing the Finnish knowledge regime, first and foremost, the Finnish and to some extent Nordic context is most important, I would argue. What is also important is take the role and nature of the Finnish welfare state, the public domain, into account. As indicated before, what works in Finland doesn't necessarily work in the UK and the other way around. The welfare state, the public domain, the tradition of a networked society with many different public and private actors is extremely important. It shouldn't be replaced by an understanding of a knowledge regime which is not fitting the Finnish situation and tradition. What is important also is to have valid data and performance and competitiveness. Is it so that Finnish research is less competitive? What are the indicators and what is meant with the competitiveness of Finnish research? And there's also an emphasis on removing sectoral barriers, yes, but at the same time I would argue it's very important to strengthen sectoral profiles. There's been a question about the role of the universities of applied sciences, a very important question. And in addition to the universities of applied sciences, there are other actors, organizations in the Finnish knowledge regime, and each of them should have a clear profile, whether the profile is the current one or a new one, also to prevent that each sector in case of a missing or a lacking national vision. Each sector is developing its own mission and its own profile, independent of how it fits into the Finnish knowledge regime that is being aimed at. And finally, performance, just to come back to this question of competitiveness, the Norwegian government is producing annually a comparison of the Norwegian R&D sector in comparison with the other three Nordics, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Austria and the Netherlands. Very interesting data, and the new 2017 barometer has just been published. You can find it on this website, and it shows that the Finnish, at least with these indicators that the Norwegian use, the Finnish R&D system is very competitive, and it's strengthening its competitiveness in a number of ways, at least if you put it in this group of 6 countries. You can look, for example, at the performance of a part of the R&D sector that's not necessarily use-oriented. The ERC, the European Research Council, some refer to it as the Champions League of European research. In this European Research Council, Finland as a whole is performing better now in Horizon 2020 than it was in the 7th Framework Program. When it comes to the total number of grants awarded as part of the to Finland, as part of the total number of grants awarded in general, as well as part of the ERC grants awarded to the Nordic countries. Finland was performing not as good as Denmark in FP7, but has reached a level of Denmark, and you can see also as part of the percentage of the ERC grants awarded to the 4 Nordic countries, almost a quarter now is awarded to Finland, which is a considerable increase. And if you look at it in more detail and compare it to other countries, where is this kind of research taking place, then you see that the countries that are performing strongest, that is the UK, the Netherlands, Switzerland, there practically all the ERC projects take place in the university sector, not in a research institute sector, not in industry. The countries that are struggling more, like Germany and France, to be successful in ERC competition, there the research institute sector plays a strong role. So this is also a reminder that it's important to think of sectoral profiling and also to do justice to sectoral profiling in trying to strengthen each of the sectors in a knowledge regime system within its own agreed upon mission. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Peter. There were some highly interesting points there. The knowledge regime gives a useful analytical tool also for us to consider. There are some very interesting pointed questions on the Screen.io system. I will let Professor Maassen have a think about those while we continue to our next speaker, and after that we'll take all of the comments directly to them and then continue to discussion. So now moving on to Dr. Paul Cunninghamin. He is a Senior Research Fellow at the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research. His research interests include the development and application of evaluation methodologies, higher education and industry collaboration mechanisms, and the development of research and development indicators. Dr. Cunningham has undertaken numerous studies for a number of bodies, including the UK government departments, research councils, the OECD, and the EU Commission. It's my privilege to invite you to take the floor now, Paul.
Well, thank you very much to the Prime Minister's Office and to the evaluation team to invite me here today, and thank you for coming along to spare your valuable time to listen to what I and others have to say. I would like to point out straight away that I'm not by any means an expert on the Finnish system, so I won't presume to make any comments or be prescriptive about future actions, but having looked at a number of systems in the past, had similar problems, or perceived as problems anyway. There are a number of lessons, I think, that can be learned from some of these examples. There are also some lessons that can be avoided from some of the examples that I've looked at in the past. But generally, I think we can agree, first of all, that, and I apologise for the small size of the print on some of my slides. I expected a much smaller venue without people at the back with binoculars. What we've seen over the years is what I meant to do was use this as an introductory slide. In fact, I think it can serve as a concluding slide as well. And the message is that, for example, in the case of climate change, it doesn't matter how good your research system is, how well funded it is, how close to the ground and how much it uses foresight. If you can't translate the results of the research system into policy action, if you can't make that connect, the interface between science, research and policy, then really you need to sort of refocus on the whole system entirely. So it's not a matter of just restructuring your research system, it's a matter of finding ways to take on board the advice that's being produced by that system. And some of the examples that I want to look at try to grapple with this problem from a variety of angles. So as we've seen already, it is a changing world that we live in. It always will be, always has been. But there are national priorities, what you could call the local altruistic concerns of government, national priorities on society, health, environment. There's the global issues, the global altruism, if you like, where problems cross national borders have to be dealt with, issues such as climate change, natural disasters, epidemics, changes in security. And finally, there's the remit to the problem of innovation and industrial competitiveness. And that's more, you could say bluntly, that's more prompted by self-interest, national self-interest. How can we compete better with our neighbours and those across the world? The requirements for all these are still the same. You need a combination of long-term information and understanding of what's going on, what has gone on, and what is likely to go on in the future. And you need to deal immediately or rapidly with emerging crises. You need to respond very quickly. You need to turn your science system to focus on emerging issues, and you need to turn your policy-making system into means of putting actions into place. For these reasons, you need multi- and interdisciplinary capabilities, and also you need to deal with funding constraints and to deal with, or to consider, a whole range of potential business models on how you fund the research system, how you maintain it over the long term, and how you would make it immediately adaptable to changing conditions. So as we've seen, there's been a number of typical responses in governance. There are advisory councils, advisory committees, national academies and learned societies play a role. Some countries introduced what we call chief scientific advisors. In some countries, such as the UK and New Zealand, these chief scientific advisors no longer directly advise the Cabinet and Prime Minister's office, but also sit within various government departmental bodies. There's typically been a mission-oriented approach, usually around a sector or a disciplinary focus. It can be a mixture of reactive processes, reactive management, reacting to new changes, but more recently there's been the use of foresight and horizon scanning techniques which hopefully enable government departments to foresee likely future problems. The problem is, though, that many of these problems are wicked problems that no one can foresee. So therefore, there has to be a capability that is able to adapt quickly to new challenges whilst being able to focus on maintaining a long-term capability in some areas. There have been moves in a number of countries to become increasingly cooperative. For example, the higher education private sector engagement, the use of university research, semi-private and private research. New governance models, examples here are in the UK and in New Zealand, where there's been a mixture of privatised, government-owned, contractor-operated, or fully publicly integrated bodies. It requires the creation of new networks, and it particularly requires the engagement of stakeholders. Sorry, I didn't realise that this had actually gone into an animated mode. One example that is quite useful to look at is the in Canada, the so-called STEPS report, which was Science and Technology Excellence in the Public Service. This report, quite dated now, 2001, identified a number of needs for government advice in terms of support for decision making, how to develop policy in the future, how to develop regulations and standards, support for public health, safety, environmental and defence needs and security needs, and also enabling economic and social development. So the typical needs that we've identified already. And they identified a number of characteristic areas for that their research should be developed along. The issue of originality, so the question of quality of research should be new knowledge. The research coming out should be independent. It should be a third-party independent assessment, not geared or steered by political considerations. There should be consistency, so there's a need for ongoing data provision. There should be long time sets of data to enable trends and changes to be mapped fully. A range of clients need to be addressed, and the scope of that research is also very broad. So it encompasses from leading edge fundamental research all the way through to what they defined as related scientific activities, such as disease surveillance, monitoring and testing, archiving, even museum and media services, because of course the public is another major stakeholder from this research, and the outcomes of such research needs to be communicated to the public as well as the policymakers. Yes, and timeframes, again, short-term to very long-term goals. They came up with a number of principles. First of all is the definition of scientific priorities and programs, and this has to reflect the diverse needs of the clients and stakeholders. Of course, prioritization is always needed in the face of resource constraints, but there has to be another overlaid set of criteria that reflect the longer term needs of scientific evidence in the future. Proposal and project selection, another clear area where selectivity is crucial to meet a variety of needs. The issue of scientific inquiry, not just originality and objectivity, the usual scientific criteria, but also ethical behavior and ethical needs. And then the outcomes were also considered by the report team, ranging from immediate results to the ultimate impacts, so accounting for all the likely and potential applications and uses, and finally, perhaps most important, the communication of those results to the entire set of stakeholders. And how was this research system to be operated? There was a number of pillars that were put forward. Foundation of excellence was the first, which first of all requires leadership, top-down leadership, political steering, and then management at the local level. So each of the knowledge producers had to have strong management principles and processes in place. And then obviously there has to be a capacity to address current and emerging needs, basically to be defined as human resources, infrastructure and equipment, and financial resources. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there has to be a clear and explicit science policy interface that transmits the results of this research into policy actions. The pillars of excellence in government science and technology were defined as I said before, quality, relevance, transparency and openness, and ethics. And then there are a number of mechanisms that were suggested to be put in place to ensure this quality and excellence. So we have review, quantitative metrics, indicators, benchmarking, satisfaction impact analyses, a balanced approach, and communications. So this set of guidelines were adopted by the Council of Scientific Advisors, and the government took them on board. And the last review of the Canadian system showed that they seemed to be addressing the needs as required. Moving to the UK, this was a study that we carried out from Manchester. We were requested to undertake a very quick review for the UK public sector research establishments, basically the government laboratories. There's a diverse array of these. There's over 140 of them. Many are run by cultural institutions by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. There's a number of health institutes run by the National Health Service. There are departmental research bodies funded along sectoral and mission-oriented lines by government departments, and then the research councils, the bodies that fund basic and fundamental research, mainly in the universities, also run a number of institutes, centres and units. So there's a whole range of funding models that are operated, a whole range of activities carried out by this diverse set of organisations. And over recent years there's been a strong political pressure for partial or full privatisation of the PSRE landscape. So our remit was to undertake a review of all the PSREs and to help in developing a set of principles that could be used to inform their review in the future. Now, each of the PSREs is subject to a rolling process of review. Every 4 or 5 years, their activities are reviewed. And it was necessary to develop a set of performance indicators, if you like, but broad performance indicators, that would actually take account of the broad range of activities that these carry out. So the key issues here, I won't go into the details, but the science capability, what they're doing, how do they actually do it, what their requirements are for doing that, what the government requires from the science that they're carrying out, what impact they're making on economic growth, what impact they're making on societal needs. The system level consideration, so just not looking at them individually, but what form, what part of the overall system do they comprise? How do they fit into the jigsaw? And also the location. Whilst these tend to address national needs, they also form a very important resource for example, SMEs and local companies in terms of providing research facilities and activities, and so they have a spin-out effect or spillover effect into their local economies. Broadly, our findings echoed what we've heard before. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to reform and to review. If any attempt is made to identify the roles that are most crucial, there will have to be a system of trade-offs. No one business model will fit all the different types of institute and all their roles, and will not be applicable across all the dimensions of their activities. It was identified that it's essential that departments and government met regularly as a whole to review their policy and regulatory support needs and how they might be best met and how the system would fit into these needs. And we identified 8 basic principles that would be observed in any single institutional review. I've left that in an annex to these slides due to the time constraints. Another example of restructuring occurred in Ireland. And again, I apologise for the small size of the print here. The Programme for Research in Third Level Institutions. Third Level Institutions is the Irish term which basically encompasses higher education institutes. Essentially, this was aimed at making the Irish universities work in a more strategic and cooperative way, forcing them, or encouraging them, I should say, to produce strategic statements of their direction for over the next 4 or 5 years that fitted in with not just local and their own needs, but also national goals. The review of this, which was carried out in 2004, was very favourable. I won't go into the details too much, but overall it's felt that the justification for the investment was fully valid and should be continued. The prioritisation of PRTLI research was becoming much more firmly established on a priority basis. There was a better, more professional attitude towards strategic planning, and more importantly, the research scale and critical mass was being developed, not just within institutes, but there was a level of cooperation that was greatly increasing. Collaboration was being achieved across the entire country. The outputs as well were increasingly showing up much better on international indicators of citation and publication numbers, for example. Another study, this one carried out by the Commission, and it looks at, in the same way as the Peterson study that Peter mentioned earlier. This was commissioned by the European Commission, and in the typical way that the European offices are concerned, they wanted to typify and categorise all the types of scientific advice production methodologies that were extant at the time. And this looked at 20 European states, plus overviews of the US, Japan and Canada, and a number of transnational advisory bodies. The rationale for it is given here. I won't go into the underpinning reasons for the study, but the conclusions weren't particularly surprising. There's a huge level of variation in terms of the role of the national parliament, the role of government, the range of research activities that are carried out. The most important thing in the Finnish context, though, is the outcomes showed that there were some elements of good practice. I know good practice is not necessarily transferable, but the key issues were openness and transparency, the issue of independence, that is, the research that's being undertaken is largely independent from political considerations, the level of cooperation, again, that word cooperation, collaboration between advisory bodies, and prioritisation on the courses of action that were being taken. A number of other reviews that are relevant, but we don't really have time to go into, are the Crown Research Institutes in New Zealand. There's some further details in the slides that can be seen online at a later date. Cooperative research centres in Australia and the networks of centres of excellence in Canada. These are more innovation focused types of initiative, but again they put the firm emphasis on the restructuring of the research system and on the collaboration between networks and various centres. And lastly, the Danish Iraq review in which I took place. Here the restructuring was along the lines of the innovation-focused or linear model of innovation organisation of the various institutes that were funding research in Denmark. One of the outcomes was the suggestion that the overall system could be greatly simplified and making much more open and transparent to the people who were actually trying to claim those funds or apply for those funds. And this led into the Denmark Nation of Solutions strategic plan, which emphasized the role of a strategic framework for taking the research system forward. Lastly, you have a number of key references. I won't go into them, but they're there just for background reading if anyone is particularly interesting. And I've added some appendices to these slides just for further background, but because of the time I won't go into them at the moment. But I'd like to thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your valuable comments and thought-provoking reflections on the international cases. Now we have about half an hour for questions and comments directly to our presenters. There are some questions there that we'll be taking from the screen IO. Please feel free to add more comments and questions there also. I'd now like to invite all our speakers to the stage, so you can pose your questions also directly to them, and we'll have hopefully a good discussion on the many issues we've covered so far. When you ask the questions, again, please present yourself and your institution, so we and those following through stream will be able to know who's speaking. And try to keep your comments fairly brief so that we have as many possible participants as we can. Okay, we now have all our presenters ready for your comments, and since Professor Maassen has had some time to think about the excellent questions on Screen IO, could I ask you to pick one of them and give your ideas on that?
Yeah?
Yeah,
okay.
Now it works.
Just one button. Yeah, thank you for the excellent questions. And each of these requires a thoughtful answer. I will start with, if it's okay with you, with the last one about the structures and the processes, because that's an important question if you think about the reform and the way in which the structures are intended to be changed as well as processes. What's the right balance between changing organizational structures and changing processes? Can processes be changed significantly without organizational restructuring? Well, of course, the starting point here has to be what didn't function anymore in the organizational setup. What was the kind of problem that was identified in the way in which, let's call it that way, the Finnish knowledge regime was working? Why was it felt that the research information that was available for decision making wasn't the kind of research and information that was required? So it's important to take as a starting point what I also indicated when it comes to Campbell and Peterson's work, that in times of crisis there is a much more need for sense making than in regular times. Sense making of why are we in a crisis and why are the investments that are made by society in an organizational structure that's supposed to produce knowledge and supposed to produce ideas, supposed to produce information. Why isn't that providing the solutions for us to deal with the crisis in an effective way? What I think is important is indeed that both have to be changed. You have to look at the organizational structure that is coming out of a different time. It's a cliche, but our times have changed quite dramatically because of technology in a number of areas, and looking at the organizational structures that are available for producing knowledge and adapting them was not just in Finland, but as Paul and I have shown, an issue in many countries. But what is important is to prevent in organizational changes a situation where all organizations are supposed to do the same, where all have to be innovators, knowledge producers, idea generators, and where all have to compete for the same mission and compete for the same funding. So I think one challenge in a situation like in Finland, as I referred to, is to look very carefully at sectoral barriers and sectoral missions, and to make sure that the reform is producing an organizational landscape which can deliver more relevant information, which can produce the kind of networking and processes that are of relevance, but with preventing that the organizational renewal and the development of processes comes first and foremost from the sectors and from the research organizations themselves. So what is extremely important to find the balance here is to have an overall governmental vision on the landscape, the knowledge regime, what are the organizational structures that we need. Denmark, as I was referring to, decided that there was no space for a separate independent government research institute, a public research institute sector, and it was decided that they should have to integrate into the university sector. And there was a vision behind it. Whether everyone agreed with that or not, that's another matter. And the processes that took place afterwards were very important, because a new kind of competitive market for the research that ministries needed was created in that. So can processes be changed significantly without organizational restructuring? In many cases, yes, but I would argue as the starting point for the Finnish reform, the situation in Finland was somewhat different, and I would say that the processes here could not have been changed without significantly changing the organizational structuring. But whether the organizational restructuring that is taking place is fitting the kind of knowledge regime that Finland wants to produce, that's another question. But that's one of the questions that the reform will try to answer.
Yes. Thank you very much. That was a comprehensive answer to a good question. Now let's go to questions in the audience. Anyone wanting to pose a direct question or a comment to one of our presenters? Yes.
Vice Rector Jouko Väänön from the University of Helsinki. This is a comment, really. There was this question on whether research results are taken into account in decision making more, perhaps because of the TULA or not. I would like in this evaluation to see some examples of success, perhaps. And I mentioned one which I have in mind. Of course, when we think of decision making by politicians, then there is a political will also. So as we see when we read the newspapers, there is all the information, and there was a kind of cartoon about it, but the decision is not made if there is not enough political will. But and climate science was mentioned. In fact, in Finland we have a very massive climate science project, which is really international and coordinates international climate science effort, not only in Finland. And I think that there has been some influence in political decision making. When I look at actions by our President Niinistö when he meets Putin and when he meets world leaders, he takes up this topic of climate change. And okay, he makes a political decision. Maybe he would make it anyway, but maybe our massive project in Finland on climate change research, which, by the way, involves very strong cooperation between universities and sector research institutes like the Meteorological Institute. So it is really an example of this TULA development. Maybe that can be viewed as a positive example of influencing with science and this kind of TULA type of cooperation in decision making.
Thank you. We could take another question or comment before giving the presenters a chance to respond. Is there someone else who would like to pose a comment at this stage? No? Okay. Would one of you like to respond to the comment by Vice Rector?
Yeah, I think that this is like a comment for us to do the evaluation work, and yes, indeed, we have been thought or planned to do some like concrete case studies, and I think that here the main aim of the reform to have research results that are used in a decision making. It's very complex to really analyze because the decision making is so complex, involving different stakeholders, and it's basically a value choice. The politicians, they make the value-based decisions, and researchers aim to produce some objective knowledge. And also the researchers do not agree on the complex issues that what is the right choice. So you have to compromise, and that makes it challenging. So that how is the different research results taken into account when you make the complex decisions where very often there is no right choice existing. So then it is more like looking at the processes that how it's like taken into account, and I think that's a good example that, for example, if the President Niinistö takes up some issues that are brought up by the scientists, then that's like a very positive like way of using the research. So it's like there are a lot of challenges that how to have a good evaluation results that whether the research results are taken into account. And I think that the case study approach might be the only way to have some good understanding that what are also the obstacles and what has not gone well in some cases and what should have been done.
Thank you. Paul had a response also.
Is that?
Yes.
Yes, right. Okay, good. Yes, I think having worked in evaluation for several years, the question of success is something that always comes up, how you measure success. And the problem is that you can turn the question round and say, well, success as measured by whom? There are various stakeholders to whom success may be different. So if you're a researcher, then if you publish a lot of high-level publications and they're cited, then that's success, and you can measure that through a series of indicators. If you're a politician, then success will be perhaps being seen to have run a program that is well accepted and seen to have done well, and it reinforces your case for re-election the next time round. If you're a member of the Treasury or the Finance Ministry, then success is that the money you spent has justified some form of return, and you've got a high level of leverage, and that you can see that the taxpayers' money, and you can justify that taxpayers' money has been spent well in this particular case. So I think that the problem is that faces the evaluators here is that research towards the public good is not always a one-off output. It contributes in a various number of ways, and trying to map how the various outcomes of that research flow into eventual policy decisions is very difficult. So I think the thing to be careful of is that there has to be a triangulation of evaluation processes that encapsulate indicators, case studies, surveys, satisfaction surveys, for example, and that there's never one single indicator that can be put in front of a politician that says this was successful. It has to be a case of engagement, and the politician, the policymakers who commission the evaluation have to be, if you like, learned customers for the evaluation itself. They have to appreciate that there are nuances that have to be described, so that you cannot put the outcome of an evaluation in one paragraph on a minister's desk.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Please continue, Peter.
Yes. Yes, thank you. This was a very important point, of course, issue of success, and how do you measure success? And the example you gave is, of course, a very important example, but it also is an example where we realize how important the political context is. Just this weekend, there was an interview with a professor at the University of Oslo, working in the area. She's a biologist and working in the area of the impact of climate change on plants. And she was mentioned last year as one of the most 100 important persons in the US, most influential persons. She decided to move from the US because the political climate has changed, and no research is allowed, whether it's in applications or in public reports, to use the term climate change anymore. So the political context determines, in this sense, that what was a success before, a contribution to a better understanding of the impact of climate change, is now seen as a negative element within that political context, with consequences for the move. So the area, the knowledge area that you're referring to, has a very strong political dimension, and of course a knowledge dimension, but it's a global topic where Finland alone cannot solve all the issues, but has to determine, amongst other things, what role will Finnish research play in the global need for better knowledge about the impact of global change, climate change. So that's part of the vision, of course, that's required from the government when it comes to developing green technology, research on climate change, etc. And if we would translate that to I realize it might not fit the Finnish situation completely, but if we take the 3 pillars of Horizon 2020, the excellence pillar, which isn't directly use-oriented, but as Helga Nuoti and others have said, we don't know what we don't know. So we need to invest in research which strengthens our understanding of basic issues. And then there's the grand challenges, which is directly related to what I called before sense-making and industrial competitiveness. Now, when it comes to the Finnish situation, where is the Finnish strength, being a relatively small country with even though it's still a rich country, a limited budget, where does Finland want to invest when it comes to this excellent part? And how can you continue in those areas where Finland is world leading, continue to play a world leading role? And is climate change, research in climate change, part of that? Will Finland continue to invest heavily in that? But there's no direct link, in my view, between that agenda and that vision and a relatively short-term need for new ideas and new knowledge and new foresight, etc., information that can help to deal with societal problems and change dynamics in Finnish economy and society in general. So the question of where the sense-making has to take place in Finland is also of relevance when it comes to determining indicators for success, and what is success, and where can we expect a meaningful contribution from the various actors, from the University of Helsinki to think tanks to whatever other organization is of relevance in the Finnish knowledge regime. And only if there's a general agreement on indicators of success, which as indicated, will be different in Finland than in the US, then there can also be a meaningful measurement of success and an understanding why are in certain areas the links now between research and information better than they were before. What have we done that produced these better results, and is it meaningful to take that as examples also for other parts of the system, because not every organization and every unit has the same role to play in the knowledge regime in Finland.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Liisa Laakso first, and then Per Mikvits after that.
Yes, thank you very much. I just have a question concerning the role of universities and research training, because it's essential, for instance, doctorate training in order for our potential to respond to the needs of knowledge or short-term needs of knowledge, and that requires much more than just managing research projects or doing research. And I think that particularly for doctorate training, it is essential that as much of this kind of thematic research needs as possible are integrated to universities, and that the research institutes that still are taking responsibility for sectoral issues should be as close to the basic functions of universities as possible.
Thank you. Let's take Per Mikvits' question directly after that, and then I'll give the floor to our panelists here. Katri.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm Per Mikvits from the Finnish Environment Institute and the Strategic Research Council. I have just a methodological question related to following up on this about case studies to assess the use of knowledge in decision making. I mean, of course, as Mari pointed out, it's a very good way to go into the nitty-gritty, what has facilitating it and what hampers the use of knowledge. But on the other hand, there is the risk that you don't get the comprehensive picture from just using case studies. It's very crucial then how you pick your cases, and if you pick these good cases, you might be accused of cherry picking, and if you pick just where it has failed, you may get a too sort of depressing view of the situation in the Finnish society. So I would like to ask you, what other information and methods are you going to use except for case studies in order to get the full picture of how knowledge is used in decision making in Finland? Thank you.
Thank you for great questions. I think I'll give the floor to Mari first, since both questions are quite directly.
Yeah,
Please,
so
Mari.
if I just directly, this is like a methodological question, and I think that as Paul pointed out, that it's a matter of triangulation. So there is no one method or one measure actually for this success. So I think that we have to look some cases that of course in Finland there's also a challenge that we have interesting cases more than we have resources to analyze in depth. I mean, that's just talking about the reform of our, let's say, social health sector reform is a big issue where a lot of like research is needed, and a lot of things are going on, or like a climate change. So it is not it's not sufficient, and it is no way to understand the complex picture totally. But the other methods, I think that what we shortly went in the beginning, that there is a planning to do some survey type of quite extensive surveys, and in a survey you can have the overall impression and opinions. You don't go in depth in the dynamics of this decision making, but you have some sort of feeling. feeling issues and can ask questions. Then I think that the thematic discussions that we have in these regional workshops that we are now planning, it's like that we aim to have there some sort of a focus group like method and some thematic like structure for those discussions. And it could be that we there also could somehow incorporate with some concrete cases to go through. And then I think the one important thing is that we have the wealth of material of the projects, and there of course it's these both the new funding instruments and the projects done there are requested to report and plan more carefully the dissemination and the plan for the stakeholder involvement. So that's of course at the project level we have to go into detail to look basically that which consortia have been doing the work, what has happened at the project level, and the project level evaluation material will be like one material that we like look and have an overview. But I think that there was one of the comments on the screen also that one challenge here is that when we really are doing work together to solve and some of the problems or produce the knowledge, the project perhaps is not at the moment the right level to look. It should be more like the ways how the stakeholders cooperate and the continuous dialogue, so that you basically, which type of discussions are held in different occasions or in different meetings, and who is having a network, or who is calling to a friend when they have an urgent problem. So it's more like the way of working together, which is more important than a project, and it's difficult to tackle. But anyway, the project material is also very useful. So those are the ways how we are going to have some facts on the table.
Thank you. Peter, you would like to comment on Lisa's question quite briefly?
Yes, well, it's an excellent question because this is an example of an area where organizational structures and processes have to be reconsidered. The traditional way of training doctoral students within universities, where most of the doctoral students would get a career in academia, these days are behind, and we see in most advanced societies the predictions of the development of the labor market that at least one area where there's agreement there will be a growing need, that is people at the level of PhD, so highly trained knowledge workers, let's call them that way. But it also goes for bachelor and master. I think the time that knowledge-based education meant that teachers present the knowledge that they produced and that others have produced and transferred to their students, they are behind us. Knowledge-based education now means preparing our students for work in knowledge-intensive work environments. And it means that we have to reconsider the way in which we organize our curricula in close cooperation with public and private sector employers, and also looking at other organizations where especially doctoral education graduates find their job. So the institute sector is an important example. Denmark decided to integrate the institute sector into the universities, and one of the arguments was that the capacity of workers in the research institute should become available for education in the universities. For various reasons. And another argument was related to doctoral education, to make sure that the doctoral graduates would come to work in an environment where they had been trained instead of falling, in some cases, in between knowledge institutes with a role in doctoral education and universities. So we see graduate schools, we see other kinds of cooperation structures. The EU is financing in Erasmus Plus doctoral programs where industry and universities are cooperating, and there are different ways in different countries of handling it. Norway has opened up for the University of Applied Science sector to have doctoral programs. Before recent mergers, there were 22 institutions in Norway that were allowed to offer doctoral degrees. Germany, there you see that the Fachhochschulen now more and more also get a task in doctoral education. It has to do with the different kinds of needs in the labor market for different kinds of doctoral graduates. And I think we have to reconsider the way we organize our doctoral education. It doesn't mean that we have to move them away from the universities, on the contrary, but to introduce there a network, a cooperation kind of element in a more effective way than has been done until recently, I think is an important challenge.
Thank you. Now we have a couple of minutes left to our other Screen IO question. Now remember, you may continue to reply and comment on these the entire day. The mindset for using research as a strategic resource for decision making has improved, but how much of this can be said to be due to the TULA reform in Finland? Also, I'd like to ask my colleague Susanna if there are any comments on the Screen IO so far that we'd like to take up at this time. There's a technical issue, it seems. Okay, no particular ones to take from there. If someone has an urgent question or comment you would like to pose, this is your chance for a very brief one and a very brief answer. Yes, Ilmo.
So I'm Ilmo Keskimäki, coming from National Institute for Health and Welfare. So in fact, I would like to continue this topic on doctoral training and research training, because that's very interesting. And if I understood you correctly, so in fact, what the development in Finland has gone to a different way. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we used to have this kind of national doctoral programs, which were run by in collaboration by universities, research institutes. Mm-hmm. But that situation changed a few years ago, and the doctoral programs are run only by universities. And at the same time, what has happened is that it's in fact new research funding instruments. You recommend that they are not used for research training. At the same time, also the Research Council of Academy of Finland funding is directed more for graduated research or those who are postdoc researchers and senior researchers. So in fact, you pointed out a worry in this applied science field and policy relevant research field in Finland, that the current system is not training necessarily researchers and doctors for that type of research. It may be a good reason to raise this issue as well when you are going through the TULA reform.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent comment that we will surely take into account in the continued work of the evaluation. Now, since there's another seminar that will take up this space soon after us, I'm afraid it's time for us to close our seminar. I'd like to thank you all for participating and for your comments and questions. Also, those participating through stream, we're very happy that you were with us today. And a special thanks to our international experts who've come to Helsinki to discuss with us and give their thoughts, and will continue to cooperate with you. It's much appreciated. As it was mentioned, the evaluation has started a little over half a year ago and will continue another year and a bit. So there's plenty of activities that are still coming. It was mentioned that there will be workshops, regional workshops around the country, particularly directed to researchers and the leaders of the research institutes at regional level, and also to those providing direct services to the researchers. There will also be a survey where a great number of people will be able to provide their thoughts also on different types of cases. So we hope that you and your colleagues will continue to cooperate with the evaluation so that we get a comprehensive picture and a realistic picture of what has happened and what the effects, also the unintended consequences of the reform have been. We very much appreciate the knowledge and the insights that you give us. So just a final reminder that the Screen I/O will remain open the entire day today, so you can go back and continue to comment or pose questions. If there's something you think that we should particularly pay attention to or maybe have missed, please let us know. The comments and questions are anonymous. We will receive all of them and analyze them and use them for the planning and implementation of our further work. So it's very important information that way also. So thank you once again. I hope to see you soon in our follow-up sessions and hope you have a good day. Thank you.